The scream of a mountain lion echoed through the dense Wyoming forest. But it was the sound of a woman's voice that stopped Marcus O'Brien in his tracks that September afternoon in 1872. He had been tracking elk through the timber near the Wind River Range for 3 days, his buckskin clothing blending with the golden autumn leaves, when the melody drifted through the pines like smoke. It was a hymn, he realized, one his mother used to sing before the fever took her when he was just a boy. But this voice carried something his mother's never had, a loneliness so profound it seemed to weigh down the very air. Marcus stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, his shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown deer without strain, his arms thick with muscle from years of swinging an axe and hauling traps through mountain snow. His dark brown hair fell past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his beard was neatly trimmed despite living alone in a cabin 15 miles from the nearest settlement. He was 26 years old and had not heard a woman's voice in nearly 8 months. He moved through the undergrowth with the silence of a wolf, his boots finding purchase on moss-covered stones, his rifle held loose in his right hand. The singing grew clearer, and he could make out words now about grace and valleys and walking through shadows. His heart beat faster, not from exertion but from something he could not name. When he finally saw her, she was sitting on a fallen log in a small clearing, her face tilted toward the canopy where afternoon sunlight filtered through in golden shafts. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with auburn hair that cascaded down her back in waves, catching the light like burnished copper. Her dress was simple calico, faded blue with small white flowers, and it was torn at the hem and dusty from travel. Her feet were bare, her boots set neatly beside the log, and he could see that her stockings had holes in them. She wore no bonnet, and her face, though smudged with dirt, was lovely in a way that made his chest tighten. But it was her eyes that arrested him when she suddenly stopped singing and looked directly at where he stood hidden in the shadows. They were the color of spring grass, wide and bright with fear. "Please," she said, her voice shaking. "Please don't hurt me." Marcus stepped into the clearing, raising his free hand while lowering his rifle. "I mean you no harm, miss. I heard you singing and wanted to make sure you were not in trouble." His voice was deep, roughened from disuse, and he saw her flinch slightly at the sound. She stood quickly, her hands smoothing down her skirt in a nervous gesture. "I am lost," she admitted, and he could hear the tears threatening at the edge of her words. "I have been walking for 2 days, and I do not know where I am." "You are in the Wind River Territory, about 30 miles northwest of Lander," Marcus said, keeping his distance so as not to frighten her further. "How did you come to be out here alone?" Her face crumpled then, and she sank back onto the log. "The wagon train left without me. I went to gather water at a stream, and when I returned they were gone. I tried to follow the wheel tracks, but I lost them in the rocks, and then it rained, and I have been wandering ever since." Marcus felt anger surge through him. What kind of people left a woman alone in the wilderness? "What is your name?" "Adelaide Harris," she said quietly. "I was traveling with my aunt and uncle to California. They died of cholera 3 weeks ago, and the wagon master said I could continue with the train if I helped with cooking and mending. I thought he was a good man." Her voice broke on the last word. "He was not," Marcus said flatly. He scanned the clearing, noting the remains of a small fire she had attempted to build, the stones placed in a circle but no ash or char. "Have you eaten?" Adelaide shook her head. "I had some hardtack in my pocket, but it ran out yesterday. I tried to find berries, but I was afraid of eating the wrong kind." "Smart," Marcus acknowledged. He unslung the pack from his shoulders and pulled out a bundle wrapped in cheesecloth. "Venison jerky. It is not much, but it will keep you going." He tossed it to her gently, and she caught it with both hands, her eyes filling with tears again. "Thank you," she whispered, unwrapping the cloth with trembling fingers. She ate with small, careful bites, as though afraid the food might disappear if she was not cautious. Marcus watched her for a moment, then turned to survey the forest around them. The sun was already beginning its descent, and nightfall in these mountains came swiftly. "We cannot stay here. My cabin is about 6 miles east over the ridge. Can you walk that far?" Adelaide looked down at her bare feet, then back up at him. "I can try. Put your boots on," Marcus said. He walked to the edge of the clearing and began gathering fallen branches, making a rough travois using rope from his pack and 2 strong pine limbs. When Adelaide stood, wobbling slightly, he saw her wince as she took her first step. "Your feet are injured." "Just blisters," she said quickly. "I will manage." Marcus crossed to her in 3 long strides and knelt before she could protest. "Let me see." His hands were gentle despite their size as he examined first her left foot, then her right. The blisters were angry and red, some of them burst and weeping. "You will not make it 100 yards like this, let alone 6 miles. "Then what do I do?" Adelaide asked, and he heard the despair in her voice. "You ride," Marcus said simply. He stood and turned his back to her. "Climb on, I will carry you." "I cannot ask you to do that," Adelaide protested. "I am too heavy." Marcus almost laughed. He had carried deer and elk and once even a young bear through these mountains. This slip of a woman would weigh nothing to him. "You are not asking. I am telling you. Now climb on before we lose the light." Adelaide hesitated only a moment before wrapping her arms around his neck. Marcus lifted her easily, settling her weight against his back, his arms hooked under her knees. She was lighter than he expected, almost fragile, and he felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him that he had not experienced since his younger sister died along with his mother all those years ago. They set off through the forest, Marcus navigating the terrain with the ease of long familiarity. Adelaide was silent at first, but after a while she spoke softly near his ear. "Why do you live out here alone?" "I prefer it," Marcus said. "No complications. No people telling me what to do or how to live." "Do you not get lonely?" The question struck him deeper than he expected. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but loneliness is better than the alternative." "What alternative?" "Being hurt by people who are supposed to care about you," Marcus said, surprised at his own honesty. He never spoke of such things, not even to himself in the dark hours before dawn. Adelaide was quiet for a long moment. "I understand that," she finally said. "My parents died when I was 15. My aunt and uncle took me in, but they never wanted me. I was just another mouth to feed, another burden. When they decided to go west, I think they hoped I would find a husband and become someone else's responsibility." "Then they were fools," Marcus said gruffly. "A woman who can survive 2 days alone in the wilderness and still have the spirit to sing is not a burden." He felt Adelaide's arms tighten slightly around his neck, and she rested her cheek against his shoulder. "You are kind," she whispered. "I am practical," Marcus corrected, but there was no heat in his words. The journey took longer than Marcus had anticipated because he had to move carefully to avoid jostling Adelaide's injured feet. By the time they crested the ridge and his cabin came into view in the small valley below, the stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. The cabin was solidly built, constructed of thick pine logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney rising from one end. A small barn stood nearby, and Marcus's mule, Chester, looked up from his grazing with mild interest as they approached. Marcus carried Adelaide directly into the cabin and set her down gently in the single wooden chair near the cold fireplace. The interior was sparse but clean, with a narrow bed against one wall, a rough-hewn table, shelves holding supplies and books, and various furs and hides hanging from pegs. A ladder led to a small loft where Marcus stored his trapping equipment. "I will start a fire," Marcus said, moving to the hearth. Within minutes, he had flames crackling, their light pushing back the shadows. He filled a pot with water from the barrel near the door and hung it over the fire to heat. "We need to clean those feet and bandage them properly." Adelaide watched him move around the cabin with quiet efficiency, bringing out clean cloths, a tin of salve, and strips of soft leather. When the water was warm, he knelt before her again and carefully bathed her feet, his large hands surprisingly gentle. Adelaide hissed at the sting, but she did not pull away. "You have done this before," she observed. "I have doctored myself more times than I can count," Marcus said. "Cuts, burns, frostbite, broken bones. A man learns to tend his own wounds when he lives alone." He applied the salve, which smelled of pine and something else Adelaide could not identify, then wrapped her feet in the leather strips. "You will need to stay off them for a few days, give them time to heal." "I cannot impose on you like that," Adelaide protested. Marcus stood and looked down at her, his blue eyes steady. "You can and you will. The nearest town is Lander, and that is 3 days' ride from here. You would not make it in your condition, and I will not send you off to die in the wilderness. But where will I sleep? You only have one bed." "You will take the bed, I will sleep in the loft." Adelaide shook her head. "I cannot take your bed, I will sleep in the loft." "Your feet need to be elevated," Marcus said firmly. "And the loft has a ladder. You will take the bed, and that is final." There was something in his tone that brooked no argument, and Adelaide found herself nodding in agreement. Marcus prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, which they ate in companionable silence. Adelaide was so exhausted that she could barely keep her eyes open, and Marcus noticed. "Get some rest," he said, clearing away the dishes. "We can talk more in the morning." Adelaide rose unsteadily, and Marcus was there instantly, his arm around her waist, supporting her weight as he guided her to the bed. She sat down on the edge, and he lifted her feet onto the mattress, settling a rolled blanket beneath them. "Thank you," Adelaide said, looking up at him, "for everything. You saved my life." Marcus felt heat rise in his face, unaccustomed to such direct gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Adelaide said softly. "They would not. You are a good man, Marcus O'Brien." He had no words for that, so he simply nodded and retreated to the loft, climbing the ladder with his bedroll tucked under one arm. As he lay in the darkness, listening to Adelaide's breathing slow and deepen into sleep, he realized that his cabin no longer felt quite as empty as it had that morning. The next few days fell into a rhythm. Marcus rose early, tended to Chester, checked his trap lines in the nearby woods, and hunted for fresh meat. Adelaide remained in the cabin, her feet propped up, but she refused to be idle. She mended the holes in his clothes, organized his chaotic shelves, and insisted on helping prepare meals despite Marcus's protests. "I need to feel useful," she explained one afternoon as she stirred a pot of stew. "I cannot just lie about while you do everything." Marcus, who was cleaning his rifle at the table, looked up at her. "Your feet need to heal." "They are healing fine while I stand here stirring," Adelaide countered. "Besides, when was the last time you had a proper stew? This looks like you just throw whatever you catch into a pot and hope for the best." "That is exactly what I do," Marcus admitted, and he was rewarded with Adelaide's laugh, bright and musical. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and the sound did something strange to his chest. Over those days they talked. Adelaide told him about growing up in Ohio, about how her father had been a carpenter and her mother a seamstress, about the fever that took them both within a week of each other. She spoke of her aunt and uncle's coldness, the way they made her feel invisible even when she was standing right in front of them. Marcus, in turn, found himself sharing things he had never told another soul. About his father, a trapper who drank too much and died in a bar fight when Marcus was 12. About his mother and sister succumbing to sickness that same winter, leaving him alone. About the years he spent working in sawmills and mines, saving every penny until he had enough to buy his own land and build his cabin. "Why here?" Adelaide asked one evening as they sat by the fire, she in the chair and he on the floor, his back against the wall. "The mountains do not judge," Marcus said simply. "They do not care who your father was or what mistakes you have made. They just are. There is peace in that." Adelaide nodded slowly. "I think I understand, but do you not miss human companionship, friends, family?" Marcus was quiet for a long time. "I did at first, but after a while you get used to the silence. It becomes comfortable like an old coat." "Is it still comfortable?" Adelaide asked softly. Marcus looked at her, at the way the firelight played across her features, turning her hair to flame and her eyes to amber. "No," he admitted, "not anymore." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something neither was quite ready to name. Adelaide looked away first, her hands folding in her lap. On the 5th day, Adelaide insisted on walking outside. Her feet had healed enough that she could manage with only minor discomfort, and the confines of the cabin were beginning to feel oppressive. Marcus helped her to the small bench outside the cabin door, and she sat in the autumn sunshine, her face tilted up to the warmth. "It is beautiful here," she said. "I can see why you love it." Marcus sat beside her, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape of pine forests, rocky outcroppings, and the distant snow-capped peaks. "It is home. You ever go to town?" "Every few months to trade furs and buy supplies. I was planning to go in a few weeks, before winter sets in." Adelaide's expression grew troubled. "I suppose I should go with you then. Find some way to earn my keep until I can figure out what to do next." The thought of Adelaide leaving filled Marcus with an unexpected dread. "What would you do in town?" "I can sew and cook and clean. Perhaps I could find work as a housekeeper or take in mending. It is not much, but it is honest work." Marcus's jaw tightened. He knew what life was like for unmarried women in frontier towns. The best Adelaide could hope for was back-breaking work for minimal pay, living in some drafty room and fending off unwanted advances. The worst did not bear thinking about. "Or you could stay here," he heard himself say. Adelaide turned to look at him, her eyes wide. "What?" Marcus felt as though he were standing on the edge of a cliff, about to jump. "Stay here. With me. I know it is not proper, and I know you barely know me, but I could build a second room onto the cabin, give you privacy. You could keep helping with the cooking and mending if you want to feel useful, and I would provide for you, keep you safe." "Marcus," Adelaide said slowly, "why would you do that?" He looked at her directly, his blue eyes intense. "Because the thought of you leaving makes me feel like something is being torn out of my chest. Because this cabin has not felt like just a shelter since you arrived. Because when I hear you singing while you work, I realize what I have been missing all these years alone up here." Adelaide's breath caught. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Marcus said. "I know you are brave and strong and kind. I know you have a spirit that 2 days alone in the wilderness could not break. I know that when you smile, it feels like the sun coming out after a long winter." He paused, then added quietly, "I know I am just a rough mountain man with no education and no prospects beyond my trap lines, but I would treat you well, Adelaide. I swear it." Tears spilled down Adelaide's cheeks, but she was smiling. "You are not just anything, Marcus O'Brien. You are the man who carried me 6 miles through the mountains when you could have just pointed me toward town and sent me on my way." You are the man who gave up his own bed and tended my wounds and made me feel valued for the first time in years." She reached out and took his hand, her small fingers threading through his larger ones. "I would be honored to stay." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest, something he had not realized was knotted tight. "You are certain?" "I am certain," Adelaide said firmly. "Though we should do things properly. If I am to live here, we should marry. I will not have people saying improper things about you or me." The word marry sent a jolt through Marcus. He had never imagined himself as a married man, never thought any woman would want to tie herself to someone like him. But looking at Adelaide, her hand warm in his, he found the idea did not frighten him. Instead, it felt right, like the final piece of a puzzle sliding into place. "Then we will go to Lander when your feet are fully healed," Marcus said. "Find a preacher and do it right." Adelaide leaned against his shoulder, and Marcus wrapped his arm around her, marveling at how perfectly she fit against his side. They sat like that for a long time, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. That night, Adelaide asked Marcus about his life as a trapper. He showed her his pelts, explaining how to identify good quality fur, how to set traps without damaging the hide, the best places to find beaver and marten and fox. Adelaide listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she was truly paying attention. "It must be hard work," she observed, running her hand over a particularly fine mink pelt. "It can be," Marcus acknowledged, "especially in winter, but there is satisfaction in it, providing for yourself, relying on your own skills." "Will you teach me?" Adelaide asked suddenly. Marcus looked at her in surprise. "Teach you to trap?" "Well, maybe not that exactly, but teach me about living out here. How to recognize edible plants, how to track animals, how to survive. If I am going to make this my home, I should know how to thrive in it, not just survive." Marcus felt his respect for her grow even more. Most women he had known would have been horrified at the idea of learning such rough skills. "I will teach you everything I know," he promised. The next morning, despite Adelaide's protests that her feet were not quite ready, Marcus took her on a short walk through the forest near the cabin. He showed her how to identify the tracks of different animals, how to read the signs of the forest to know what creatures had passed through and when. He pointed out plants she could eat and those she should avoid, teaching her the subtle differences that could mean the difference between nourishment and poison. Adelaide absorbed it all like a sponge, committing details to memory, asking clarifying questions. When they came across a patch of wild raspberries, she exclaimed with delight and began picking them carefully, her fingers soon stained with juice. "We can make preserves," she said excitedly. "Do you have jars?" "A few," Marcus said, amused by her enthusiasm. "In the barn." They returned to the cabin with Adelaide's apron full of berries, and she spent the afternoon boiling them with sugar Marcus had been hoarding, filling the cabin with sweet, fruity steam. Marcus sat at the table, supposedly working on repairing a saddle but mostly just watching Adelaide move around his kitchen with growing ease and comfort. "What?" Adelaide asked, catching him staring. "Nothing," Marcus said quickly, looking back down at his work. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how different this place feels now." Adelaide set down her spoon and came to stand beside him. "Different good or different bad? Different good," Marcus said without hesitation. He reached up and caught her hand, pulling her down to sit on his lap. Adelaide went willingly, her arms sliding around his neck. "I never thought I would find someone like you," she said softly, her fingers playing with the hair at the nape of his neck. "I had resigned myself to being alone, to just surviving rather than living." Marcus cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. "You will never be alone again," he promised. "And you will not just survive, you will thrive. I swear it." Then he kissed her, gentle and careful, as though she were something precious and fragile. Adelaide made a soft sound and kissed him back, her fingers tightening in his hair. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. "We should go to town soon," Adelaide said, her voice unsteady, "before I forget all my propriety entirely." Marcus laughed, a sound that was rusty but genuine. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "We will leave tomorrow." The ride to Lander took the better part of 2 days, with Marcus riding Chester and Adelaide perched in front of him, her back against his chest. They camped the first night under the stars, and Marcus built a fire while Adelaide laid out their bedrolls on opposite sides of the flames. They talked late into the night about their hopes for the future, about the life they would build together. "I want children," Adelaide said suddenly. "Is that something you want?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, feeding another stick into the fire. "I never let myself think about it before," he admitted. "It did not seem possible, not with the life I was living, but yes. Yes, I would like that. How many?" "As many as God sees fit to bless us with," Marcus said. "And you, the same," Adelaide said with a smile. "Though I hope our first is a boy who looks just like you." Marcus felt heat rise in his face. "Why? Because you are handsome and strong and good," Adelaide said simply. "And I would like a son who grows up to be like his father." They reached Lander late the following afternoon. It was a rough frontier town with a main street of false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon, a hotel, and a small church. Marcus took Adelaide directly to the hotel and secured 2 rooms, one for her and one for himself, ignoring the knowing looks from the desk clerk. "We will find the preacher tomorrow," Marcus said as he walked Adelaide to her door. "Get some rest." Adelaide stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. "Thank you for being honorable, even when you do not have to be." "I will always be honorable with you," Marcus said seriously. "You deserve nothing less." The next morning they found Reverend Thomas, a weathered man in his 50s who served the small congregation. He listened to their story without judgment, his eyes kind. "You are certain this is what you both want?" he asked. "Marriage is a sacred bond, not to be entered into lightly." "I have never been more certain of anything," Marcus said, his hand tight around Adelaide's. "Nor have I," Adelaide added. Reverend Thomas smiled. "Then it would be my honor to marry you. Shall we say tomorrow afternoon? That will give me time to prepare and you time to make any arrangements you need." Marcus used the rest of the day to purchase supplies for the coming winter, loading Chester with sacks of flour, sugar, coffee, and other necessities. Adelaide bought fabric to make new clothes and curtains for the cabin, her eyes bright with plans. They also purchased lumber and nails, so Marcus could begin building the additional room he had promised. That evening, they ate dinner at the hotel restaurant, a simple but pleasant meal. Adelaide wore a new dress she had found at the general store, a soft green that matched her eyes, and Marcus thought she had never looked more beautiful. "Are you nervous?" Adelaide asked as they walked back to the hotel under the stars. "About tomorrow, no," Marcus said. "Are you?" "A little," Adelaide admitted. "Not about marrying you, but about everything else. Building a life together, being a good wife, raising children in the wilderness." Marcus stopped and turned her to face him. "You will be a wonderful wife, and when the time comes, an even better mother. And we will build our life together one day at a time. We do not have to figure it all out tonight." Adelaide leaned into his chest and Marcus wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "I love you," she whispered against his shirt. "I know it is too soon to say it, but I do." Marcus's heart swelled. "It is not too soon. I love you too, Adelaide. I think I have since I heard you singing in that clearing." They were married the next day in the small church, with Reverend Thomas officiating and his wife serving as witness. Adelaide wore her green dress with wildflowers in her hair that Marcus had picked that morning, and Marcus wore his best shirt and trousers, his hair neatly combed back. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Marcus kissed Adelaide with a tenderness that made Mrs. Thomas dab at her eyes with her handkerchief. They spent their wedding night at the hotel, and Marcus was gentle and patient with Adelaide, who was nervous but willing. He took his time, learning the curves of her body, the sounds she made when he touched her just right. Adelaide, in turn, traced the scars on his chest and arms, kissing each one as though she could heal old wounds with her lips. When they finally came together, it was with a sense of rightness that left them both shaken and clinging to each other in the aftermath. "I never knew it could be like that," Adelaide whispered as they lay tangled in the sheets, her head on Marcus's chest. Marcus stroked her hair, marveling at its softness. "Neither did I." They left Lander 2 days later, making the journey back to the cabin at a more leisurely pace. When the cabin came into view, Adelaide sat up straighter in the saddle. "It looks different somehow," she said. "It looks like home," Marcus corrected, and Adelaide smiled. The following months were a whirlwind of activity. Marcus worked on building the additional room, which they decided would serve as a proper bedroom, leaving the main room for living and cooking. Adelaide helped as much as she could, handing him tools and holding boards in place while he nailed them. She also began her lessons in wilderness survival in earnest, learning to shoot Marcus's rifle with surprising accuracy, mastering the art of dressing game, and becoming adept at identifying tracks and signs. As winter approached, they worked together to prepare the cabin, stacking firewood against the outer wall, hanging herbs to dry from the rafters, and storing the last of the garden vegetables Adelaide had coaxed from the rocky soil. Chester was moved into the barn with extra hay and feed to see him through the cold months. The first snow fell in mid-November, transforming the landscape into a wonderland of white. Adelaide stood at the window, watching the flakes drift down, and Marcus came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Beautiful," Adelaide murmured. "Yes, you are," Marcus said, kissing the side of her neck. Adelaide turned in his arms, her eyes sparkling. "I was talking about the snow." "I was not," Marcus said with a rare grin. Winter in the mountains was harsh, but Marcus and Adelaide found joy in it nonetheless. They spent long evenings by the fire, Marcus teaching Adelaide to read better by the light of oil lamps while she taught him the songs she knew. Her voice, which had once sounded so lonely in the woods, now filled the cabin with warmth and light. Some nights, Marcus would ask her to sing the hymn he had heard that first day, and Adelaide would oblige, her voice pure and clear. But now, instead of loneliness, the song carried hope and joy. "It sounds different when you are not alone," Marcus observed one night. "Everything is different when you are not alone," Adelaide replied, reaching for his hand. Winter also brought challenges. There were days when the snow was so deep that Marcus could barely make it to the barn to tend Chester. There was a week when a blizzard raged so fiercely that they could do nothing but huddle by the fire and wait it out. But through it all, they had each other, and that made all the difference. In late January, Adelaide began feeling unwell in the mornings. At first, she thought it was something she had eaten, but when the sickness persisted for more than a week, she began to suspect the truth. When she confided in Marcus, his eyes went wide. "A baby," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think so," Adelaide said. "It is still early, but the signs are there." Marcus dropped to his knees in front of where she sat and pressed his ear to her still flat stomach. "A baby," he repeated, wonder filling his voice. Then he looked up at her, and Adelaide saw tears in his eyes. "We are going to have a baby." Adelaide laughed and pulled him up to kiss her. "We are going to have a baby." From that moment on, Marcus became impossibly protective. He insisted Adelaide not lift anything heavy, not go outside in the cold unless absolutely necessary, not work too hard. Adelaide found it both endearing and exasperating. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she protested one morning when Marcus tried to prevent her from kneading bread dough. "I know, but what if you strain yourself? What if something happens?" Adelaide took his face in her flour-dusted hands. "Marcus O'Brien, I love you, but you must calm down. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I will be fine." Marcus sighed and pulled her into his arms. "I cannot help it. I am terrified of losing you." "You will not lose me," Adelaide said firmly. "I am strong, remember." "You said so yourself." As winter gave way to spring, Adelaide's belly began to swell, and Marcus found himself constantly touching it, marveling at the life growing inside. He talked to the baby, telling it stories about the mountains, promising to teach it to hunt and fish and survive in the wilderness. "What if it is a girl?" Adelaide asked, amused. "Then I will teach her all the same things," Marcus said without hesitation. "And God help any man who tries to court her when she is grown. He will have to go through me first." Adelaide laughed and kissed the top of his head. "Our poor future sons-in-law." In early May, when the wildflowers were beginning to bloom, and the snow had melted from all but the highest peaks, Adelaide's pains began. Marcus had been preparing for this day for months, gathering clean cloths and water and everything else he thought they might need. Still, when Adelaide gripped his hand and said, "It is time," he felt his carefully constructed calm evaporate. "It is too soon," he said, though he knew it was not. "You are not due for another 2 weeks." "Tell that to the baby," Adelaide said through gritted teeth as another contraction hit. The labor was long and difficult. Marcus stayed by Adelaide's side the entire time, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, letting her squeeze his hand hard enough to leave bruises, murmuring encouragement even when he felt completely helpless. Adelaide was magnificent in her strength, bearing the pain with a courage that left Marcus in awe finally. As dawn light began to filter through the windows, a baby's cry filled the cabin. Marcus looked down at the tiny, red-faced infant he had just helped bring into the world, and his vision blurred with tears. "A son," he said hoarsely. "We have a son." Adelaide, exhausted but radiant, held out her arms for the baby. Marcus placed the infant carefully in her embrace, then leaned down to kiss both his wife and his child. "What should we name him?" Adelaide asked, stroking the baby's downy head. Marcus thought for a moment. "Matthew," he said finally. "After my father before the drink got him. He was a good man once. I would like to give our son that legacy, the good parts." "Matthew O'Brien," Adelaide said, testing the name. "I like it. Matthew Marcus O'Brien." "You want to give him my name, of course," Adelaide said. "You are a good man, Marcus." "I want our son to carry that with him." Marcus had to look away, overcome with emotion. He had spent so many years thinking himself unworthy, damaged by his rough upbringing and rougher life. But Adelaide saw something different in him, something worth honoring, and it humbled him. The first months with baby Matthew were exhausting but joyful. The infant had Adelaide's green eyes and Marcus's dark hair, and he had a set of lungs that could wake the dead. Marcus proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle with the baby despite his own fears of inadequacy. He would walk Matthew around the cabin for hours when the boy was fussy, singing off key lullabies that somehow always seemed to work. Adelaide watched her husband with their son and fell in love with him all over again. This rough mountain man who could kill a bear with his bare hands if he had to, cradled their tiny baby as though he were the most precious thing in the world. As Matthew grew, He became the light of their lives. His first smile, his first laugh, his first word, which was "Da," much to Marcus's delight and Adelaide's mock dismay, were all celebrated as the miracles they were. Marcus built a cradle that rocked gently, carving animals into the headboard with surprising skill. Adelaide sewed clothes and blankets, singing to Matthew as she worked. When Matthew was 6 months old, they made the trip to Lander so Reverend Thomas could baptize him. The journey was more challenging with a baby, but they managed, and the Reverend and his wife cooed over Matthew appropriately. "You have made a beautiful family," Reverend Thomas said to Marcus as they prepared to leave. "God has blessed you richly." "More than I ever deserved," Marcus agreed, looking at Adelaide with Matthew in her arms. The years that followed were full and rich. Matthew grew into a sturdy, curious boy who followed Marcus everywhere, mimicking his father's movements and hanging on his every word. When Matthew was 3, Adelaide gave birth to a daughter they named Anna, who had her mother's auburn hair and her father's blue eyes. 2 years later, another son arrived whom they named Michael. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family, with Marcus adding on rooms as needed. Adelaide's garden flourished, providing vegetables and herbs, and Marcus taught Matthew to help with the trapping and hunting. Anna proved to have her mother's beautiful voice, and the two of them would sing together while working, their melodies floating through the mountain air. Marcus's trapline business thrived, providing more than enough to support the family comfortably. He made regular trips to Lander to trade furs, and the family accompanied him when the weather permitted. They became known in town as the O'Brien family, respected for their hard work and strong values. One evening, when Matthew was 10 and the younger children were asleep, Adelaide and Marcus sat on the porch of their now much larger cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Matthew was in the barn, tending to the animals. They now had 2 mules, several chickens, and a milk cow, and his youthful voice drifted to them as he sang one of Adelaide's songs. "You remember the day we met?" Adelaide asked, leaning against Marcus's shoulder. "Every detail," Marcus said, his arm around her. "You were singing that hymn, and you looked so lost and so brave at the same time." "I was terrified," Adelaide admitted. "But then you stepped into that clearing, and even though you were this giant of a man with a rifle, I somehow knew you would not hurt me." "I would never hurt you," Marcus said fiercely. "You and the children are everything to me." Adelaide tilted her face up to kiss him. "And you are everything to us. You took a lonely voice in the woods and made sure it never was again." Marcus pulled her closer, his heart full to bursting. He thought about that day in the clearing, how he had been tracking elk and instead found his entire future. He thought about Adelaide's voice carrying through the forest, lonely and beautiful, and how that same voice now filled his home with joy and laughter and love. "I was the lonely one," Marcus said quietly. "I just did not realize it until I heard you sing." Matthew emerged from the barn then, waving to his parents. "Chores are done," he called. "Come sit with us," Adelaide called back. "Watch the sunset." Matthew bounded up to the porch and settled on the steps at his parents' feet. Marcus ruffled his son's hair, feeling Adelaide's warmth against his side, hearing Anna's gentle breathing through the open window where she slept, knowing Michael was safe in his crib. This was his life now. Not the solitary existence he had thought he wanted, but something infinitely better. A family, a home, love that filled every corner of his heart and spilled over into everything he did. "Pa," Matthew said, breaking into his thoughts. "Yes, son. Will you teach me that tracking technique you mentioned yesterday, the one with reading broken twigs?" "Tomorrow," Marcus promised. "First light. And me too," Anna's voice came from the doorway. She stood there in her nightgown, rubbing her eyes. "I want to learn too," Adelaide laughed. "I thought you were asleep, little one." "I was, but I heard talking," Anna said, climbing into her mother's lap despite being almost too big for it. Marcus gathered his family close, all of them crowded together on the porch, and felt a peace so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He had spent years in these mountains thinking he was happy with his solitude, never knowing what he was missing. But Adelaide had shown him a different way, had brought music and light and love into his world. "I love you," he said to Adelaide over Anna's head. "I love you too," Adelaide replied, her eyes shining. "Always and forever." Matthew and Anna echoed the sentiment, their young voices earnest and sweet. Inside, baby Michael began to cry, and Marcus stood to fetch him, bringing the infant out to join the family gathering. Michael quieted immediately in his father's arms, his tiny hand wrapping around Marcus's finger. They sat together until the stars came out, talking and laughing and simply being together. Later, after the children were all tucked into bed, Marcus and Adelaide stood in their bedroom, the one he had built that first winter. "You ever miss it?" Adelaide asked as she brushed out her hair. "The solitude, the simplicity of living alone." Marcus came up behind her and took the brush from her hand, running it gently through her auburn locks, which were now streaked with a few threads of silver. "Not for one moment," he said honestly. "My life did not truly begin until I found you in those woods." Adelaide turned and wrapped her arms around his waist. "And mine did not begin until you carried me home." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity, each touch a reaffirmation of their love and commitment. Afterward, as they lay in each other's arms, Marcus listened to the sounds of his family sleeping around him, Matthew's soft snoring from the loft where he now slept, Anna's murmuring in her dreams from her small room, baby Michael's gentle breathing from his cradle, and knew that this was what happiness truly meant. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and challenges. There were hard winters when food ran low and everyone had to make sacrifices. There was the time Anna fell from a tree and broke her arm, and Marcus had to ride like the wind to Lander to fetch the doctor. There was the drought that killed most of the garden and forced them to rely more heavily on hunting and the preserved food from previous years. But through it all, the family remained strong and united. Marcus taught his sons to trap and hunt, to read the forest and respect the wilderness. He taught Anna the same things, despite the raised eyebrows from some folks in town who thought such knowledge was unladylike. Adelaide taught all the children to read and write, to sing and cook, to be kind and generous. When Matthew was 16, a young woman named Sarah came to Lander with her family. Matthew was smitten from the first moment he saw her, and after a proper courtship overseen closely by both Marcus and Adelaide, the two were married. Marcus, remembering his promise from years ago, grilled the young man thoroughly before giving his blessing, but he could see that Sarah made his son happy, and that was what mattered most. Anna grew into a beautiful young woman with her mother's voice and her father's strength. She had no shortage of suitors, but she turned them all down, saying she had not yet met anyone who made her feel the way her father made her mother feel. Marcus was secretly pleased, though Adelaide told him he could not keep their daughter single forever. Michael, the youngest, was quieter than his siblings but equally capable. He had a gift for working with wood and spent hours helping Marcus build furniture and tools. He carved beautiful figures that Adelaide displayed proudly in the cabin. When Marcus was 50 years old and Adelaide 47, they became grandparents for the first time when Matthew and Sarah had a son. Holding the tiny infant, Marcus was transported back to the day Matthew was born, to the overwhelming love and terror he had felt. "What will you name him?" Marcus asked his son. Matthew looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "We would like to name him Marcus after his grandfather, if that is all right with you." Marcus felt his throat tighten. It would be an honor. Little Marcus was the first of many grandchildren. Anna eventually married a kind schoolteacher who had moved to Lander, and they had 3 daughters. Michael married a rancher's daughter and settled nearby, giving Marcus and Adelaide 4 more grandchildren to dote on. The cabin, which had started as a simple one-room structure, had grown over the years into a sprawling home with multiple buildings, including a larger barn and a workshop for Michael's carpentry. The family gathered there often, filling the rooms with noise and laughter and love. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the entire family came together for a celebration. Matthew and his family traveled from their farm 20 miles away. Anna and her husband brought their girls from town. Michael and his wife were already there, having helped Adelaide prepare for days. As Marcus looked around at the table full of children and grandchildren, at Adelaide presiding over the chaos with serene happiness, he could barely remember what his life had been like before he had found her singing in the woods. That solitary existence seemed like a dream, something that had happened to another person entirely. After dinner, Adelaide's children begged her to sing, and she obliged, her voice still pure and clear despite the years. She sang the same hymn Marcus had heard that first day, but now it was joined by other voices, her children's, her grandchildren's, her husband's rough bass underneath it all. The song filled the cabin and spilled out into the mountain air, no longer lonely but triumphant. That night, after everyone had settled down for sleep in various corners of the house and outbuildings, Marcus and Adelaide walked outside under the stars. The mountains loomed around them, eternal and unchanging, but everything else had transformed completely. "Thank you," Marcus said quietly. "For what?" Adelaide asked, though she was smiling. "For getting lost in my woods, for singing loud enough for me to hear, for agreeing to stay, for loving me, for giving me all of this." He gestured back at the cabin where their family slept. Adelaide reached up and cupped his bearded face in her hands. "Thank you for finding me, for carrying me home, for making me feel valued and cherished every single day, for being the man I always hoped existed but never thought I would find." They kissed under the starlight, surrounded by the mountains that had witnessed their entire love story. Marcus pulled Adelaide close, and she rested her head on his chest, right over his heart. "You remember what you promised me that day in the clearing?" Adelaide asked. Marcus thought back. "I promised you would never be alone again." "And you kept that promise," Adelaide said. "Every single day for 25 years you have kept that promise. And I will keep it for as long as I draw breath," Marcus vowed. They stood together in the darkness, 2 people who had found each other against all odds and built a life richer than either had dared to dream. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the faint sounds of a baby crying and someone getting up to tend to it, Sarah, probably, with little Marcus. The sounds of family, of life, of love continuing forward into the next generation. Marcus thought about the boy he had been, angry and alone, convinced that isolation was strength. He thought about the man he had become, who had learned that true strength lay in opening your heart to love, no matter how terrifying that vulnerability felt. He thought about Adelaide, who had been so lost and alone herself, who had found the courage to trust him, to build a life with him in this wild place. "I love you," he said, not for the first time and certainly not for the last. "I love you too," Adelaide replied, the words as natural as breathing. They returned to the cabin hand in hand, and as they prepared for bed, they could hear the gentle sounds of their family all around them. Marcus climbed into bed beside his wife, pulling her into his arms as he had every night for 25 years. Adelaide settled against him with a contented sigh, her head on his shoulder. "Good night, my love," she whispered. "Good night," Marcus replied, kissing her forehead. He lay awake for a while after Adelaide's breathing had deepened into sleep, thinking about everything they had built together. He thought about the children they had raised, who were now raising children of their own. He thought about the home they had created, not just the physical structure but the sense of belonging and love that permeated every corner of it. He remembered that first night, lying in the loft while Adelaide slept in his bed, how his cabin had felt less empty just from her presence. He had known then, even if he could not admit it, that she had already begun to change everything. Now, all these years later, he could not imagine his life without her, without the family they had created together. Marcus finally drifted off to sleep with Adelaide warm and safe in his arms, the sounds of his family breathing around him like a gentle symphony. He dreamed of mountains and forests, of a voice singing in the wilderness, of two lost souls finding their way home to each other. The years continued to pass in their familiar rhythm. Marcus and Adelaide grew older, their hair turning silver, their movements slowing slightly, but their love remained as strong as ever. They watched their children raise their own families, passing down the values and lessons Marcus and Adelaide had taught them. The grandchildren grew, and eventually, great-grandchildren began to arrive, filling the homestead with new life and energy. Through it all, Adelaide continued to sing. Her voice, though aged, still carried that pure quality that had first captured Marcus's attention. She sang while she worked in her garden, while she rocked great-grandchildren to sleep, while she and Marcus sat together on the porch watching the sunset. And Marcus never tired of hearing it, that voice that had led him to his greatest treasure. On a warm summer evening when Marcus was 68 and Adelaide 65, they sat together on their porch as they had countless times before. Their great-grandson, young Thomas, was playing in the yard with a wooden horse Michael had carved for him. The mountains rose around them, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. "You have any regrets?" Adelaide asked suddenly. Marcus considered the question seriously. "Only one," he said finally. Adelaide looked at him in surprise. "What?" "That I did not find you sooner," Marcus said. "That we did not have even more years together." Adelaide smiled and took his hand. "We have had a good life, Marcus O'Brien, a very good life." "The best," Marcus agreed. Little Thomas ran up to the porch then, his face flushed with exertion. "Great-grandma, will you sing me the song about the valley?" Adelaide opened her arms and Thomas climbed into her lap. She began to sing, and Marcus closed his eyes, letting the familiar melody wash over him. This was the same song he had heard all those years ago in the clearing, the one that had sounded so lonely then, but now was filled with nothing but love and joy and fulfillment. As Adelaide's voice rose and fell, carrying across the mountains that had been their home for so many years, Marcus felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had been given so much more than he had ever deserved, a love that sustained him, children who honored him, grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried on the legacy he and Adelaide had built together. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple. Thomas fell asleep in Adelaide's arms, and she carefully stood and carried him inside to lay him down. When she returned, Marcus held out his hand, and she took it, settling back into her chair beside him. "Thank you for loving me," Marcus said quietly. "Thank you for making sure my voice was never lonely again," Adelaide replied. They sat together as darkness fell and the stars emerged, one by one, until the sky was filled with their brilliant light. Inside the cabin, they could hear the sounds of family Thomas's mother preparing dinner. his father telling a story, the warm hum of conversation and love. Marcus and Adelaide O'Brien, who had found each other in the wilderness so many years ago, who had built a life and a family against all odds, sat hand in hand under the stars, their hearts full, their souls at peace, knowing that their love story would continue on through their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren for generations to come. The mountains stood eternal around them, silent witnesses to a love that had transformed two lonely souls into the foundation of a family legacy. And somewhere in the pine trees, if you listened carefully, you could still hear the echo of a woman's voice singing, no longer lonely, but surrounded by all the love she and her mountain man had created together.